Hi, this is Johnny Red here, handing out red pills to whoever will take them. In this video, I will examine how the words racist and racism came into such popular use in the United States in particular, and in the West generally. There is a meme that has been going around on the internet for several years that attributes the invention of the word racist to Trotsky. Although Trotsky didn't actually make it up, he may have popularized it. The first recorded utterance of the word racism was by a man named Richard Henry Pratt in 1902. Now, Trotsky published a piece called What is National Socialism in June 1933, and he mentions racism several times in there. Here's an excerpt from that piece. To investigate retrospectively the genealogy of ideas, even those most reactionary and muddle-headed, is to leave not a trace of racism standing. On the plane of politics, racism is a vapid and bombastic variety of chauvinism in alliance with phrenology. As the ruined nobility sought solace in the gentility of its blood, so the pauperized petty bourgeoisie befuddles itself with fairy tales concerning the special superiorities of its race. Obviously, Trotsky was an ardent anti-racist. He considered racism to be the solace of the ruined nobility and petty bourgeoisie. Around the same time, the Frankfurt School, a Marxist think tank in Germany, moved to Columbia University and started spreading communism to students and some professors, which would introduce students then to the writings of Marx, Lenin, and Trotsky. As you can see from this engram graph, although the words racist and racism were invented near the beginning of the 20th century, their use didn't really begin to ramp up until the mid to late 30s. This later chart, which goes up to the year 2000, shows that the little uptick in the 30s was nothing compared to what happened since the 60s. The use of the words racist and racism are now many orders of magnitude greater than they were in the 30s. So let's go back in history to see how the concept of racism was sewn into the public consciousness and how it evolved to what it is today. The words racist and racism were virtually unheard of until the 1930s. In the early 20th century, most people simply acknowledged racial differences and didn't think twice about them. It was considered normal for the different races to keep mostly to themselves. Birds of a feather flock together was the common view. So first, the current politically correct view of race. Here are the basic tenets. 1. That race is a useless concept, a social construct. We are all one race, the human race. 2. There are no innate differences between the races that are significant. Everybody has the same potential. Any differences that do exist, such as in poverty, crime rates, unemployment, illegitimacy, and educational achievement, are all due to environmental causes, especially slavery, colonialism, segregation, and discrimination because of racism. 3. Any expression of a desire to live among and preferentially associate with people of your own race, if you are white, is evidence of racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. Even having white babies is a sign of racism. These beliefs are now so entrenched in public consciousness that they are taken as axioms. They are repeated by virtually all mainstream news media, taught in all of academia, and portrayed as reality by the entertainment media. We are told that these beliefs are the modern, enlightened way of seeing things, as opposed to the backward, ignorant, and outmoded way that prevailed in the dark past. So we will start by going back to that dark past, to the beginning of the 20th century, when Franz Boas first became influential in American anthropology. Boas was reared in a Jewish liberal family in which the revolutionary ideals of 1848, French Revolution, remained influential. He developed a left-leaning liberal outlook which was influenced by science and politics. Boas' views conflicted with the then prevalent idea that cultures had evolved in a series of developmental stages, which were labeled savagery, barbarism, and civilization. These stages were associated with racial differences, and the modern European culture was at the highest level of this gradation. Wolff, 1990, page 168, describes the Boasians as calling into question the moral and political monopoly of a Gentile elite, which had justified its rule with the claim that their superior virtue was the outcome of the evolutionary process. This is why Boas was so against any evolutionary basis for explaining human differences. Boas' theories were meant to counter the racialist theories of Houston Stewart Chamberlain and American eugenicists like Madison Grant, whose book The Passing of the Great Race, 1921, was highly critical of Boas' research on environmental influences on skull size. I'll talk about that more a little later. In 1884, Boas gave an address to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, where he was ending his service as vice president of the anthropological section. That address, entitled Human Faculty as Determined by Race, was Boas' manifesto on relativity. 17 years later, he was to repeat it almost word for word in The Mind of Primitive Man, one of his major works. His thesis was that mental differences between races could be traced, on the one hand, to differences in cultural traditions, and, on the other hand, to flawed academic traditions of the scientists observing these differences. When Boas says flawed academic traditions, he means racism and any previous research that shows biological racial differences. So you can see how the current belief that race is meaningless or just a social construct, and that what differences do exist are not in our genes, but are the result of environment, had its origins in Franz Boas's ideology over 100 years ago. Degler, in a book called In Search of Human Nature, The Decline and Revival of Darwinism in American Social Thought, from 1991, notes that, quote, the shift away from Darwinism as the fundamental paradigm of the social sciences resulted from an ideological shift rather than from the emergence of any new empirical data. So the shift from evolutionary biological theories of human differences was based on Boas' anti-racist ideology rather than on any new evidence. His influence continues to this day, though it is being challenged by genetic studies that show a biological basis for such differences. An egregious example of the ideologically driven nature of Boas' theories was his claim that the skull shape of immigrants to America changed as a result of exposure to American environment. He measured 13,000 skulls of Bohemians, Hungarians, Central Italians, Jews, Poles, and Scots, and published his results in a book called Changes in Bodily Form of Descendants of Immigrants. He cited this as evidence that environment trumps heredity as a reason for physical and cognitive differences between the races. Recently, however, 2 American anthropologists reanalyzed Boas' data and say that he erred in saying that environment influenced human head shape. Boas' data, the scientists say, show almost no such effect. In re-examining Boas' published data, Dr. Corey Sparks of Pennsylvania State University and Dr. Richard L. Jantz of the University of Tennessee found that the effects of the new environment of the immigrants were insignificant, and that the differences between parents and children and between European-born children and American-born children were negligible in comparison to the difference between ethnic groups. Dr. Jantz said that Boas was intent on showing that the scientific racism of the day had no basis, but he did have to shade his data some to make it work that way. By 1915, the Boasians controlled the American Anthropological Association and held a 2/3 majority on its executive board. In 1919, Boas could state that most of the anthropological work done at the present time in the United States was done by his students at Columbia. Boas was determined to spread his ideas throughout the anthropological community, not only by his own efforts, but by the efforts of his students. By educating his students to accept and promote his vision of anthropology, and by gaining control of important journals and professional associations, Boas and his students would dominate the field by the 1920s. By 1926, every major department of anthropology in the U.S. was headed by Boas students, the majority of whom were Jewish. At the same time, followers of John B. Watson, the behavioral psychologist, were gaining predominant influence in psychology, and the social sciences became increasingly unified around the basic concepts of environmental behaviorism by the early 1930s. By then, the twin currents of cultural anthropology and behavioral psychology joined to form the torrent of environmental behaviorism that would soon sweep over the American academic world. Both groups were united in supplanting the concept of instinct with that of habit. That is, that there were no innate behaviors, and in stressing the greater explanatory power of cultural and social environment over biology in understanding human behavior. The underlying theme was that biological explanations of human behavior were inherently racist. In France, Claude Lévi-Strauss interacted extensively with Boas and acknowledged his influence. He also had a strong Jewish identity and a deep concern with anti-Semitism. Like many Jewish intellectuals discussed here, Lévi-Strauss's writings were aimed at enshrining cultural differences and subverting the universalism of the West. Like Boas, Levi Strauss rejected biological and evolutionary theories. He theorized that cultures, like languages, were arbitrary collections of symbols with no natural, that is, no biological, relationships to their reference. Levi Strauss rejected Western modernization theory in favor of the idea that there were no superior societies. The role of the anthropologist was to be, quote, a natural subversive or convinced opponent of traditional usage in Western societies, while respecting and even romanticizing the virtues of non-Western societies. Western universalism and ideas of human rights were viewed as masks for ethnocentrism, colonialism, and genocide. He evoked the beauty, dignity, and irreducible strangeness of third world cultures that were simply trying to preserve their difference. His writings would soon feed the suspicion among the New Left that all the universalist ideas to which Europe claimed allegiance, reason, science, progress, liberal democracy, were culturally specific weapons fashioned to rob the non-European other of his difference. Back in the U.S., Boas's stated goal was to debunk what he called scientific racism. Even the term scientific racism itself is just a clever way to inject ideology into the realm of science. You might as well say scientific prejudice or scientific creationism. The intent is to tarnish the science of the day with a poisonous ideology or a very unpopular, morally repugnant ideology. Science and racism have nothing to do with each other. Racism is a belief. Science deals with facts. Scientific research that shows differences between the races, physical differences, mental differences, emotional differences, behavior differences, is not racism. It's just science. Racism is a belief system. It can be based on science or not, but there is no such thing as scientific racism. It's either scientific or it's racism. They're not related. They don't have anything to do with each other. The descendants of Boas students are still at it today. They're still trying to portray any scientific research that shows innate differences among the races in terms of behavior or intelligence as being racist and unscientific. Degler in 1991 emphasizes the role of Franz Boas in the anti-Darwinian transformation of American social science. Quote, Boas' influence upon American social scientists in matter of race can hardly be exaggerated. Boas engaged in a lifelong assault on the idea that race was a primary source of the differences to be found in the mental or social capacities of human groups. He accomplished his mission largely through his ceaseless, almost relentless articulation of the concept of culture, which, like a powerful solvent, would in time expunge race from the literature of social science. So, now you see how we got to the current politically correct notions of race. It was not through any scientific breakthroughs or new evidence, but it was largely due to the efforts of an ideologically driven crusader against the so-called scientific racism that prevailed in the early 20th century. Our dominant beliefs about race are actually based on lies, as Boas has been shown to have engaged in deceptive, devious methods to push his agenda. More recent science has actually confirmed the biological reality of racial differences. Though DNA testing tells you your ancestral heritage to a high degree of accuracy, this is really just saying that it can tell your race. In the following video clip, Charles Murray, one of the authors of The Bell Curve, gives us a glimpse of where genetic science is going and how it's going to clash with the current dogma of egalitarianism.
The bell curve is going to become relevant again for a reason that was not the bell curve's topic, and that has to do with group differences. Because the genome has been decoded, we are now identifying specific single nucleotide polymorphisms known as SNPs, which are the thing that determine differences. We've identified hundreds of those related to educational attainment, which of course is a proxy measure for IQ. We're learning lots about the genetic determinants of personality characteristics. We're learning lots about the physiological differences between men and women and cognitive differences and the rest. And the short statement is, it's what created the controversy about the bell curve, that we are going to, we, the geneticists, which do not include me, are going to unravel this story over the next 10 years, to a large degree.
Well,
the picture won't be complete in 10 years, but the progress in doing it is exponential. They have extremely powerful new methods of doing it, And for those with eyes to see, it is already quite clear, which should be obvious to everyone, and it should not be scary to anyone. Groups of people are different. I'm not talking about whites and blacks. I'm talking about Welshmen and Irishmen, for heaven's sakes. I'm talking about French and Germans. That there are all sorts of ways in which groups of people who have been identified sociologically or anthropologically as groups are also different genetically, and they will have different outcomes in life for reasons that are genetic in origin and are not the fault of the unfairness of society, and that goes in spades for males and females. All of this runs against the prevailing, it's more than political convention, it's dogma. The dogma is that if men and women are different in important outcomes of life, it's the result of the unfairness of structures and systems. If blacks and whites are different in outcomes of life, etc., etc., etc. We are facing over the next 10 years a headlong crash between a deeply held dogma of the social sciences and the way the world works as revealed by the physical sciences.
It will be interesting to see how much of the new genetic research makes it into the public consciousness. I'm sure the mainstream media and academics will try to spin it so as to cast doubt on the genetic causes of racial differences in important human traits such as intelligence and temperament. Indeed, the spin machine has already started. An article recently published in The Guardian by Kevin Mitchell starts with "Why Genetic IQ Differences Between Races Are Unlikely." The Guardian, May 2nd, 2018. Then there is the annual academic conference on subjects like genetic racial differences in intelligence that have been meeting almost clandestinely at the University of London for 4 years. No one knew about it, but once they found out about it, the usual moral panic ensued. James Thompson, the lecturer who organized the conference, got the 2 minutes hate, the SJW mob protested, and the mainstream media hauled out the rent-a-quote leftist scientists to dismiss race and race differences in IQ. The leftists immediately trotted out a series of articles, many by academics or scientifically trained journalists, arguing that races do not differ in IQ. Here are some examples of the titles. So egalitarian dogma still rules the mainstream media and informs virtually all social policies. Another major influence in the social sciences for the past 40 years has been Stephen Jay Gould. His book, The Mismeasure of Man, is a staple of leftist thought on race. Like Boas, he was a Marxist, and like Boas, was not above fudging his data and outright lying about scientific facts and slandering those whose research contradicted his anti-racist ideology. My next video will critique The Mismeasure of Man using one of his ideological adversaries, Arthur Jensen, in a detailed rebuttal of Gould's assertions from his book. Till then, and I can't say how long it'll take, but it'll be in the next couple of weeks, stay well and keep on asking why.